Hello everyone, how's it going? Welcome to Crack a Pack a Day. Every day, I'm going to open a booster pack of Magic the Gathering cards and evaluate the contents, choosing one of them to take, as if I were taking part in a draft, and this was pack 1, pick 1. Today, we're going to be opening a pack of the just released Battle for Zendikar. Returning to the adventure world of Zendikar last seen in Rise of the Eldrazi, Battle for Zendikar pits the planeswalker Gideon Jura and his allies against the otherworldly horrors of the Eldrazi and their insatiable hunger. It's a little early to know whether it's a slow or a fast format, so I'm going to evaluate these cards assuming that it's somewhere in the middle and that both aggro and control decks are viable. Let's open the pack up and take a look. Our first card is Maya's Malice, a sorcery for 3 and a black. Target opponent discards 2 cards. It has awakened 3 for 5 and a black. Maya's Malice is this set's discard spell. Most sets have a spell in black that forces your opponent to discard a number of cards. In this case, Maya's Malice forces them to discard 2. We usually see this effect for around 3 mana, making Maya's Malice a little expensive for what it does. It's obviously a tax on the card due to the flexibility that the Awaken ability gives it. Getting a 3/3 for 3 and forcing your opponent to discard 2 cards is a pretty reasonable deal, so I think you're going to want to cast the spell for its Awaken cost more than not. Bear in mind that awakening a land means that you're opening your lands up to being destroyed more often, but that's an inherent risk of the ability. Overall, I think Maya's Malice is a reasonable card, but it's not the kind of card I fancy taking first. Taja Restore, an 0/1 Elf Scout ally for 2 and a green. It has Converge and enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it for each color of mana spent to cast it. A 1/2 for 3 is pretty bad. A 2/3 for 3 is a little subpar but playable, especially with the ally subtype on it, and a 3/4 for 3 is a pretty good card. Therefore, I reckon that you're going to want to play this card in a 3 to 5 color ally deck. You'll be a little sad if you only get to use 2 colors on it, but quite happy with 3. It's probably going to be a little difficult to play it on turn 3 with 3 different colors of mana, so it'll probably be best on a slightly later turn with other cheap allies so you can hopefully trigger Rally twice in one turn. If there's a playable 4 or 5 color ally deck in Battle for Zendikar, then Taja Restore will fit in very nicely. But, as a pack 1 pick 1, it's not something I'm going to want to take. Up next is Clutch of Currents, a sorcery for blue. Return target creature to its owner's hand. It has Awaken 3 for 4 and a blue. A 1 mana sorcery speed bounce spell is nothing exciting, though playable in the right deck. But the Awaken ability makes this card a lot better, I feel. A 3/3 for 5 isn't too great, but combining that with the ability to bounce a creature in a single card makes this fairly powerful. Imagine the situation where you're racing your opponent, who leaves behind a single blocker. You cast this on his blocker and an untapped land, then swing your entire team in, including the newly animated land. That's not a too uncommon scenario. Overall, this card is just okay when used normally, and somewhat good when cast for its Awaken cost, which I think makes it pretty good overall. It's probably not worth taking as a first pick, but it's certainly a card to think about taking sooner rather than later. McKim D Patrol, a 2/3 human knight ally for 2 and a white. It has Rally. Whenever it or another ally enters the battlefield under your control, creatures you control gain Vigilance until end of turn. A 2/3 for 3 is a little subpar, but still playable, so the value in this card is more in the ally subtype and Rally ability. Sadly, this card's Rally ability isn't anything to shout home about, but it's a nice bonus if you're racing your opponent. Overall, This is probably a good filler card in an ally deck, but has a reasonable chance of being cut in any other deck. I don't think it has enough power to consider taking it first. Kozelek Sentinel, a 1/4 Eldrazi drone for 1 and a red. It has Devoid, and whenever you cast a colorless spell, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn. A 1/4 for 2 isn't something we see very often. It's actually a little bit more efficient on the vanilla test, though the fact that most of the stats are in the toughness are a little weird, in red at least. If you're in a colorless deck, then later in the game, when you can hopefully cast 2 or more spells in one turn, this becomes a pretty nice attacker, but earlier in the game, it's mostly just an efficient blocker. If there's a red control deck in this format, then Kozelek Sentinel is going to be an essential early drop for it, but otherwise I can't see that many decks wanting it. I don't think it's powerful enough for me to consider taking it first. Cloud Manta, a 3/2 fish for 3 and a blue. It has flying. A 3/2 with flying for 4 is a little unexciting. It does have 3 power in the air, but the 2 toughness is a little bit of a letdown. It would likely trade down against a number of 3-drops, if it weren't for the fact that it has flying. Even so, it's still a little vulnerable. I reckon that Cloud Manta is a relatively solid card, but you're not going to want to take it first. Our next card is Scour from Existence, an instant for 7 colorless mana. Exile target permanent. If you absolutely need to get rid of something on the board at instant speed, Scour from Existence is what you need. The problem comes from the fact that it costs 7. If you have this in your opening hand, then you've effectively mulliganed, because you're not going to be casting it before turn 7 at the earliest, and, more likely, turn 9 or 10. A lot of threats in the format cost less than 7, so it's not the most efficient of removal spells either. It's a powerful card, but outside of ramp decks, I think you're going to want to put it in the sideboard, and see if your opponent plays anything that costs 7 or more. I don't think I'm going to be taking this first. Grave Birthing, an instant for 2 and a black. It has Devoid, and target opponent exiles a card from his or her graveyard. You put a 1/1, colorless, Eldrazi Scion creature token onto the battlefield. It has sacrifice this creature, add 1 to your mana pool. Draw a card. In terms of efficiency, this spell isn't the best. Getting a 1/1 for 3, even at instant speed, isn't great. But it does a lot of little things that add up. First of all, it replaces itself, so you're not down on card advantage. Secondly, it can potentially enable processing, since your opponent exiles a card from their graveyard. Note that if they don't have a card in their graveyard, that you can still cast it on them, then get the token and draw a card. That's perfectly legal. Finally, you get an Eldrazi Scion token, which can act as a small roadblock if necessary, but it also ramps you slightly. Theoretically, you could cast this on turn 3, then play a 5-drop on turn 4. Overall, this probably evens out to be a reasonable card, but it's not the kind of card that I want to take for pack 1, pick 1. Broodhunter Worm, a 4/3 worm for 3 and a green. This is a reasonably solid card. It only takes a slight hit on the vanilla test, but you still get your 4 power for 4 mana. Generally, you're never going to cut this from your deck, but it's not really worth taking first, I reckon. Spell Shrivel, an instant for 2 and a blue. It has Devoid, and counter target spell unless its controller pays 4. If that spell is countered this way, exile it instead of putting it into its owner's graveyard. Most counterspells are sideboard cards at best in draft. They're a little too situational for most decks to main deck. While Spell Shrivel is technically a soft counter, 4 mana is a lot to pay to prevent it from having its effect. It would certainly have some kind of effect in the middle stages of the game. It also helps with process, as it'll exile the card. All in all, Spell Shrivel is a sideboard card that you should save until you know that you can afford to bring it in against a slower deck. As such, I won't be taking it first. Our first uncommon is Grove Tender Druids, a 3/3 Elf Druid ally for 2 green-white. It has Rally. Whenever it or another ally enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay 1. If you do, put a 1/1 green plant creature token onto the battlefield. Essentially, this can be a 3/3 for 4 or a 4/4 for 5, spread on 2 bodies, if you choose to use its ability on the turn you play it. Neither is especially great, but the flexibility does help you with your mana curve. The fact that it can re-trigger off of other allies is also good, as long as you keep yourself under curve after you cast this. The 2 colors of mana in the casting cost is something to note, but as a 4 or 5 drop, it's not so bad. Still, I don't like committing to a color pair so early in the pack, especially considering that this isn't a premium gold card, so I don't think I'll be taking this first. Rolling Thunder, a sorcery for X red. It deals X damage, divided as you choose, among any number of target creatures and players. The last time this was printed, in Tempest, it was a common. It was also in an environment filled with X1s, so you'd often kill multiple creatures with it. In Battle for Zendikar, there are 25 creatures with toughness 1, 16 cards that create scions, and 4 cards that create other X1 tokens that can be killed by this. Taking overlapping into account, that means that there are 40 of these cards in Battle for Zendikar. That's a pretty hefty chunk of the set, so it's entirely possible that casting Rolling Thunder for even a modest amount will net you multiple creatures. It can also be cast directly at players, which is always useful as a win condition, especially if you can drag your game out longer so you can play more lands. All in all, I think Rolling Thunder is an extremely solid card. It's certainly the best card in the pack so far, and may well be my pick. Infuse with the Elements, an instant for 3 and a green. It has Converge. Put X +1/+1 counters on target creature, where X is the number of colors of mana spent to cast Infuse with the Elements. That creature gains trample until end of turn. If you cast this spell with only 1 or 2 colors of mana, then you're going to be very disappointed. This spell is going to want to go in a deck that produces 3, and preferably more, colors of mana. The fact that it's green helps, because green ramp often allows you to tutor for basic lands, so you can possibly splash additional basic lands in your deck. Casting this with 3 colors is going to make it an okay combat trick, whilst casting it for 4 will definitely make you happy. However, I wouldn't want to commit to a multicolor deck like that with my first pick, so I'm going to pass on this card. Our rare is Conduit of Ruin, a 5/5 Eldrazi for 6 colorless. When you cast it, you may search your library for a colorless creature card with converted mana cost 7 or greater, reveal it, then shuffle your library and put that card on top of it. Also, the first creature spell you cast each turn costs 2 less to cast. As a 5/5 for 6, this scores pretty well on the vanilla test. Being colorless, it can go into decks of any color. And as a 6-drop, unless you're playing with or against a hyper-aggressive deck, you're probably going to be able to cast it. How useful is that first ability? Well, if you want to make the best use of it, then you're going to want to also draft 2 or maybe 3 other big creatures for it to tutor. If you only have 1, then you run the risk of having them both in your hand, so that Conduit of Ruin's ability won't have any effect beyond shuffling your library. Also note that the creature card goes on top of your library. If your opponent has a flying or otherwise unblockable ingest creature, then you're probably going to want to not use the ability. I actually managed to get to do that at the pre-release against one of my opponents. The second ability has a lot of synergy with the first. You go search out a larger creature, then you can play it cheaper. If you have an 8-drop and a 9-drop in your deck, then you can search out the one you know that you can play. The former, if you don't currently have a land in hand, and the latter if you do. It's also pretty good on its own. Being a form of ramp, although by the time you get Conduit of Ruin out, then you're probably not going to have many creatures left in your hand. Overall, Conduit of Ruin seems like a very solid card and may well be my first pick. And finally, a Forest and an Eldrazi Scion token. Let's have a look at our pack. To me, the two standout choices are Rolling Thunder and Conduit of Ruin. Taking Conduit of Ruin first implies that I'm going to be in a ramp deck with a lot of big creatures. Whilst Conduit is colourless, the ramp deck is likely going to be centred in green. On the other hand, the double-coloured mana in Rolling Thunder's casting cost commits me somewhat to red. Personally, I feel that Rolling Thunder is an overall better card. It can be used in more decks, has the potential to be a 2-for-1 or better, and can even be a win condition. Rolling Thunder is my choice. And that's about all we've got time for today. If you disagree with my choice, then please let me know in the comments below, on Facebook, or on Twitter. Have a good day now!